So let's open the debate. We've had 5 interventions, very interesting interventions. So we're opening the question session. So if you have any question, please raise your hand. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for your presentations and your intervention. I wanted to make a comment. I'm Andrea Pacheco Gonzalez. And I'm an investigator from Chile. I've been living in Madrid for 25 years, and I'm part of the committee of the collection of Thyssen-Bornemisza. And I think I've been working in a very committed way for 10 years with the community I feel part of. Which is basically the community of the South America art, which is a community that's been growing and growing every day. And I really feel we're like a family. We're something really special, and we are part of this collective, and I'm basically the representative of this art practice of South America. And I basically wanted to go into detail about something. And I would like to tell you, everybody, it's not really a question for someone special. And it's basically the work we do in Europe in the museums. One of the presentation, I think it was Juan Angel Lopez about the project in the Thyssen, was talking about an investigation study that was developed between 2020 and 2021. And it was an investigation that wanted to clarify some data related to the confirmation of the directive group of the context of the city of Madrid. And as you know, Madrid as the city, I think Mercedes, if I get it wrong, please correct me, is one of the city with the most cultural experience, museum cultural experience in the Spanish context. So I think this was very important when he was mentioning the debate, the decolonialism debate, and all the people that were working in this project in the cultural organizations, the people exactly who was working on it. And the data we obtained were revealing to understand exactly the almost intermittence. There's not a lot of fluidity in this debate in this organization in the last 10 years, especially in the Spanish context. In the next few months, we're going to launch the second report that contains the exact data. And this data says that more than 80% of the institution, the cultural institution of museums of Madrid, do not count with migrant people or racialized people in their directive teams or curators teams. And in the case of a lot of them, it's basically 0%. So the total of that representative is an 80% probably without any racialized or migrant people in their teams. So why am I doing this comment? Why am I bringing up this data? I think it's very interesting for this debate, because the decisions that are related to the colonialism do not come from the institution, but come from the people who work for these institutions. And the commitment of this is something given from the people for the institutions, and especially the people who take these decisions in these teams, basically. So I would like to ask a question now, not only to the ones who are at the table, but in general, the organizers. Fernando, I don't know if Andres for Museo de América is here today. But we know that the data already exists, but what I would like to know, what's the protocol, or what are the ideas that we can bring up for people that come from other museums in Europe in terms of generating a transformation, a proper transformation in the inside of this institution, so we can replicate this in the different institutions. And this is all related in the way we do things, and in what way just we almost penetrate these contents in the different museums, how we can use these speeches and these topics if these institutions are basically planned and designed from people that did not experience this framework and did not have this experience we're talking about. I think this is not enough. In most cases, the experience they have. So how can we handle this? How can we talk about migration in the institutions if people that work in the institution do not have that vital experience on their skin? So this is basically my question.
I'm sorry, I'm going to respond in English. It's a double challenge. There's a challenge in terms of recruitment. And then once people who have this experience, I liked the translator talked about under your skin. Because, of course, when I talked about expert, it's not just intellectual academic expertise, it's also expertise. Talking about racism is, I can talk about it, but maybe I can't feel it the same way as someone who has experienced racism. So in terms of recruitment, our ambition is to go for more diversity. We have some, but I don't think it's sufficient. But we have asked an academic to work with people within our institution, because once you have this diversity, you need to organize it, and you need to make sure that people have a safe space in which they can function. And I already talked about it, but I must admit that within our there is strife, there is struggle, there is conflict, and we have to look for solutions to make sure that everyone is in a safe space, both those who come with a more diverse background, but also the white people. In the end, you want them to continue to work in a safe space. And creating that safe space is quite a challenge. If I would have all the answers, I would give them. There is some, it's about transparency, it's about people being able to participate. But as a director, for example, I also feel that I want to move on sometimes and to get results. I want an exhibition, a temporary exhibition every year. Both are sometimes conflicting. Sometimes you need longer debate before you move on. I'm the bad guy there. I sometimes say I want results before that date. So it's a real challenge. I won't say more about it.
I think you were also talking about the museums who organized this seminary. And I think this works both for the Ministry of Culture and the State of One. We know that the access to our work in general institutions is mostly administrative. Like, for example, in other ministries is the same. And you know that usually it's open only to people who are Spanish. That's the problem. Of course, there's nothing that facilitate that inclusion. Apart from that problem, I don't know exactly what can be, what a solution can be for a more inclusive access. I think the only possibilities just like Bart said, through recruitment. I think they're working on this in the Thyssen also. I think the most important is the framework and just work in the same line, starting from the moment, and just having some people that represent those possibilities and different realities. But I think on an internal framework right now, we have to work on the museum policies about the temporary recruitment to projects, to different projects with confidentiality framework, and that is open to the diversity of the people. But right now, I don't think we really have a lot more solutions. This is our only possibility, and I think this will evolve. But for now, it's not the case. And of course, institutions adapt to their realities. But I think that for now, we're working on it, and we're trying, as the museums, we're trying to do it, of course, in the limits of the administrative conditions. I will be very direct, like I was in my presentation. I don't know if it's the same in Spain, but at least in Portugal, um, I don't know if what's happening. They don't hear me. I think you do. In Portugal, the humanity disciplines are a very difficult topics. There's a lot of people working on these disciplines, but the ones that manage to do a good work in these disciplines are people coming from very good families. Recently, the director of museums in Portugal were basically women coming from very good families without a PhD, and that is a process that started to change right now. So just imagine how it would be for example, people that comes from African descendant communities of people to reach those roles in museums. It's very difficult for them. There are not a lot of places. I think the only museum in Portugal, the Ancient Art Museum, they have half of the workers that Chile has in the Memory Museum, and it's the same situation for a middle class Portuguese person. So it's really not easy. Or history, for example, that have African origins, but it's very difficult to get in. And it's the same situation for a middle class Portuguese person. So it's very. Good morning. This is Fernando from the Anthropology department for the Complutense.
My first question is for Director Ouvry. I would like to thank you, your transparency and your honesty of bringing here the debate on specialists, activism, and opening the museum. I would like you, if you could go further on this idea of transforming the African Museum in a place where you could debate racism. No, because I want to. If you could go a little further on this idea, the exhibition they are preparing on explaining what racism is. No.
I have another question for Amanda. It was a pleasure to listen to you. I would like to ask you something about something that really impacted me, and it was the speech about what you said that nobody's innocent. So, all the topic about the lost innocence. How do you consider that? Because, as you said, at the end of the day, this topic, this lost innocence, will take us to a place that we do not want to reach. And we're talking about restoring what we lost. And the other question is for Gonzalo. Uh, it's gonna be in Portuguese. Well, I cannot translate Portuguese. Sorry. I will try. He's been in Spain 24 years. And I wanted to ask you something. This debate was really hard, and I think in our countries even more, it's been harder, especially given the idea. Sorry, I do not understand Portuguese.
Um, it's a difficult question. Museums historically reflect very much our society. When they were created, they were there to show off what the authorities, the upcoming authorities, was the king's. It represented the king's, the state's museum. Today, for example, in our case, and I think it goes for most of our museums, we still reflect society. We are state museums. It means that we have a hierarchy. In practice, our society doesn't work anymore like that. People now expect to be representative, to be represented. So how do we bring this form of democracy, however bad it functions outside, how do we bring it into our museum? That is the challenge. And of course, I'm just laughing, but me as a king, how do I produce democracy? How do I organize that? That is the challenge. How do I organize this participation? Certainly, if this participation, in the case, for example, of the African diaspora, this African diaspora is extremely diversified. Even among Congolese, there are, I don't know how many associations. Many of them are not really interested in museums. What we do today is that we, where before we had a system where we really had institutionalized this, it meant that in practice there was a very limited group of people who, not on the basis of their experience or their knowledge of cultural, spiritual, etc. traditions, had a say in the renovation of the museum. I can tell you in the end, it all ended in tears and there was quite some conflict. Now we try to build gradually, slowly, a system where people, based on certain items, certain themes, we get them into the museum, and we have advisory boards which are linked to projects or to themes, which are thematic. Does it work? I don't know yet. But I believe it's important that if people have a say in things, that at least they can develop a certain understanding of things, and that it's a two-way street. But for example, in my case, to be very clear, I'm very jealous of my Dutch colleague, because there are two directors, and one of them hails from, I think he's of Ghanese origins, Wayne Modest. I think he was mentioned here.
Jamaica is from Jamaica.
Jamaica. Oh, sorry. I will apologize to Wayne. Anyhow, he has lots of expertise, but frankly, it makes the functioning easier. This kind of solutions, which you cannot always create, because I believe that one of the most difficult positions in the World Museum is Wayne's position, because high hopes are vested in him, and he can never respond to all of them. But we have to find solutions, and we're stumbling. It's more a muddle through than a grand strategy. Sorry.
Thank you so much for your question. Exactly, we are living in a moment of fragmentation. in terms of demands, identity demands. And I think we're considering it also in the feminist movement in a very brutal way. And tomorrow I will announced right here. He's going to be giving a conference in the Reina Sofia. She is going to give a conference in the Reina Sofia, I'm sorry. And I was talking with her, and she is one of the leaders in the feminist leader. So what I asked was, what did we do wrong in this movement to get the result? And of course, she recognizes it. She feels responsible since she is a white feminist. And I would claim that in this sense, this is a very complex moment in history where probably we should review and rethink in terms of uh, ideological contexts, given the identity state we're in as the different countries, and where does this concept of capitalism comes in terms of these identities, because this is also happening in a very radical way, and we have to think what are the other framework we can build in theoretical terms. Sometimes the academy has actually a very big depth in this context, and I think the limitation, the cultural limitation, are very big. And in a very critical way, they added points to debate. Right now, the results of the cultural studies, especially in the US and UK, they had results that had to be debated. They were not really clear. We don't have to go back, of course, to the structural period and era, but I think we have to rethink the way we think. And it's also a moment, a very complex moment, because including the authority of that academy is very much questioned. For the classes, the social classes especially, and for the lack of possibility to comprehend and understand other possibilities and way to produce and to get to the knowledge. And this is a way we face this debate that is very difficult and complex, but in the frame of the intellectual production, that in this sense I actually consider museums as social projects and intellectual projects. And I think, as I said before, we have to change our overview. I was talking about the lack of clarity, how we use these concepts, and this leads to multiple difficult understanding and mistakes, errors in our conception and our concepts. And I think it's very useful to go through errors and mistakes. Sometimes you're not ready to go through this debate, but sometimes reality just overpasses us. So you have to do it with the tools you have in the moment, and just try to reach the results and try to answer to what Andrea was saying in the first moment, even though there's some things that have to do with the administrative world, and it's very difficult to handle them. It's very difficult to establish a very clear debate, and dialogue is very difficult, but it's also a very fundamental step of recognition and to understand in what way we do this. And we carry out this and we hear these new voices, and I think a lot of collectives, and in Spain especially, they manage to get to that result. I think I really know the work you have been doing in the latest years, and I do see a change. And as a person that did not live in Europe at the time, and in Spain, for example, I do see a bigger diversity in cultural terms. At least in a general overview, that's what I see. And debates are changing. Of course, they do not change fast. They don't change. They don't meet the needs of necessities sometimes. But I do see a change, and in that sense, I think there is a point where a part of the social movements have a radical overview that it's anti-constitutional, and it's very open. It's very clear. Since I've been always working in institutions, I see their what they're lacking and what that means in a social and cultural terms. But you can see that they also lived a special experience, not in the case of Mexico, but in the rest of South America, except Brazil, with there's a constitutionality that's very low. The conditions of cultural production are really unstable. So there's a problem in the structure, and this allows some things that in other places with a stronger constitutionality is very different, and the processes are stronger and more stable. For example, in other countries also of the American continent, or some regions of Mexico also, I can claim that we are in a moment where, with these institutions, we have to think what we do. And I think the only path we have is to destroy them. Because where we are right now, we don't have any other solution. I think it's a critical moment and it's very dangerous. Because if we take into account the situation of fascism, they want this institution completely broken. So we are living a very dangerous moment in history. So I think that the debate has to be contextualized in this very dangerous moment nowadays of this difficult public space and the difficulties of a democratic society. I was joking. I'm not going to talk Portuguese. It was a joke. It was really interesting because I think Portugal was one of the first countries in Europe, I think even before England or Ireland, to have a prime minister that was not European, because he was from Goa. Even if on a structural way and in the way he thinks he's European. I think it's also very interesting. The president Marcelo, he was a colonial governor of Mozambique. And I don't know if the feeling of guilt is growing given the Portuguese situation, and it's something that the current government is trying to do, and it plans to do, and they said it publicly. I'm not really sure how to answer this, but I think that in Portugal, they tried to go farther. They thought about inviting very important people with the Belgium case, for example, or the Netherlands case. They went to look for a lonely bench to the United States, and I think people got scared because they were talking a lot. They tried to do something similar to Netherlands or the United States, but the state did not have those capacities. And so when they had a change of government, well, they couldn't do it. They couldn't keep up with it. And this is how we say in Portuguese. Can you hear me? I would like to, well, thank you all for your participation today, and also for yesterday. Thank you so much. And I would like to comment what Andrea was talking about and the representative topic. We've been talking today about it and also yesterday. I think it's very important because I really agree on it with Amanda when she said the politics situation is the first step towards it, and it's insufficient to get to the results we want if we don't deepen in the colonial structure, the reality of the museums. I think we have to go farther this representativity topic, especially given my experience. I come from a working class, and apart from the work these associations and institutions are doing, like ICOM is doing, for example, I think the work they're doing is very positive and very well. I think representativity can go against us because we have to choose exactly what are the debates and the practice on a more ideological sphere that we have to choose, because it's we have this presence also in South America countries. It's not enough to have just a person that comes from Argentina, from Chile, or whatever, any other country from South America, because if that person never had that experience, it's basically useless. I don't know if you hear me well. So basically, that's my comment, because as Amanda said, it's not just enough to have women in the power, for example, like the politics we mentioned before, and the situation of the different institutions. Is just a matter of the experience those people had and the ideology they follow, how they act, how they think, how they reflect, how they keep going with their practices. Because in the case, for example, of Italy, they have a women governor, but she's from the right party, and we can have other examples. So it's not even sufficient to have a representative that is of color. It's just that we have to take into account the experience they have. And with this comment, I would like to talk about some topics that were brought in the session of the morning. I think Juan Angel was talking about this. I don't remember exactly the word you used, but you were talking about different visions and narratives in the same exhibition. You were talking about the permanent ones, but we know, as for the experience in the Thyssen, that also the temporary exhibitions, they have this relevance of the people who we work with and how we work in the museums. And I really think that this question, to put a voice or a narrative in the same position with others, like for example the ones of the racialized communities, the migrant communities, it's not enough, because we cannot see the differential power in that sense. I think the ones that are more scientific are the ones that are more known, but the ones from the racialized or minority community are not voices that we know. So personally, I do not agree with the fact that they need the same space and the same place. And according to the permanent exhibitions you were mentioning, I think we don't have to do a difference between temporary or permanent. We just have to understand how these social relationship are built. I think that's the center of the debate. In the case of Barcelona, where I'm living and I'm investigating, we have permanent exhibition that we have also just men working on it. So what does this change? What is it changing? If we're just considering the difference between the color, and in this sense, apparently the neutrality, you were saying that there's museums using technology solutions, for example, in the sense of neutrality. I think I would like to add some comments on this, to just go against the chronology of the acts of a country. I think that it's a very colonialist speech. It's not even enough to talk just about that. It's just a modern idea. So this were just some of the comments, but the question I have exactly for the colleague of Portugal, Gonçalo, you were showing a graph of the collections of the different museums, and you mentioned that you were surprised, or you were not surprised, I don't really remember, but the collections of Africa and Asia. But you were showing America divided in three parts: Central, South, and North. But America is just one continent. That division is responding to a colonial history that divided us as a continent. And actually, you could see that the collections you showed were coming from the continent of America, and I think that division does not help um, the presence of the American collections in Portugal and the rest of the work you presented. And I think that is very relevant on a deep level. When you were showing, for example, objects from Brazil, what I saw actually, they were a part of the Amazonia part. And Brazil is also a colonial country and colonized Amazonia. So I think the pieces you were showing, it was not from Brazil. There's a lot of pieces in Brazil. And in terms of restitution, that kind of language is very dangerous because you know really well the Maduce case. In Europe, for example, we have objects of Maduce with, and they say they come from Chile, but actually they do not come from Chile. They do not belong to Chile. So I would like to ask you to explain why you decided to do that and how did you use those terms and that division. Thank you. I was the last one, but anyway, related to what I mentioned, it was according to the responses we got. So people were putting Central America, South America, North America, and that's how I put it. This is in terms of responses, but in terms of quantities, they were basically from Asia, the majority of the pieces. From Brazil, as I was saying, what we got of Brazil's, if you prefer, what we have, it's exactly what we have in the National Museum of Ethnology, and it's basically collections that were produced in the 20th century, and they were made for different campaigns. They claimed they were fair, but of course I don't know, and it's of course those kind of pieces. They're not a lot related to expedition, especially for Amazonia of the 18th century. But as I said before, there was a fire, and there was the French invasion that took a lot of pieces, and some of them survived, and I showed them, I think, and they were in the Academy Science Museum. But in terms of percentage, the majority of the objects existing out of Europe come from Asia and after Africa.
It was in terms of the answers they said they had, but not about the quantity of objects or the amount of objects that they had. Maybe I got it wrong, but when it comes to responses, we had that division 13% of Central America, I think it's more or less, then 12% from North America, 14% percent South America. But when you count the objects that they gave us at the end, most of them were coming from Asia. That's what we understand from the explanation that I gave about the elites that were related with Goa. Well, thank you for your questions. I don't think if I recall one of them correctly, but let me tell you about chronological neutrality. I talked about that as some kind of fallacy or a lie that is used sometimes in museums by saying, okay, let's be objective, let's set everything chronologically, but when you put a painting behind another one, let's say in a pathway that a visitant is going through, you're creating a narrative for that visitor. Let's say the accrochage kind of setup of the collections is already creating a point of view. Chronological point of view is usually academic, illustrated as a canon perspective, and I think that's something that needs to be balanced with other views. Just like I said before with science, we need to contrast that with other points of view or other ways to show modern and old pieces of art. I think, well, that's my point of view at least, but it's not easy, I know. About staff, I completely agree. Museums have to improve their policies when it comes to procurement to hire staff so that it's more varied. What Fernando has said, I think, is very true. The fact that there are some limits from the administration. And I think that should happen just like with quotas because there's an equality law that no one actually abides by, in which we have a number of people that have to be hired. There should be this kind of percentage of initiatives, whatever. I don't know if in this case it only deals with procurement or recruitment, but let's say important or relevant positions. There's a law about that, and that is not being respected. And from the Gabeira Foundation, there was someone here shortly ago, but I think the administration should be moving forward in this sense. And for that to happen, the debate is important that initiatives such as this or debates such as this change the way people think so that they can also demand that. When it comes to the quality, I don't think museums can only say that only the valid speakers are migrant communities. I think plurality of audiences is very big, and it is true that historically we have had a domination of a specific discourse, a specific kind of public or audience, or a kind of regard that is linked to colonial ideas, but we can't just directly move to the other end or the other extreme. I think we should normalize the fact that communities have a voice in social and cultural institutions. For example, the law from Catalonia for cultural institutions, I think, is going to enforce that. It's going to make it compulsory that besides that in cultural associations, in museums, there are commissions that are integrated by people from local communities that at least have, if not a veto option, at least so that they can be heard or listened to, so that it is consultative, so that we can consult on their opinions. And I think this should be normalized. Again, going to the other end or the other extreme, I think is also not realistic. I think we should open up forums where from peer to peer we can work, we can negotiate so that everyone is listened to, or at least the academia or the museum we can't stop our links with academia overnight, but at least we should not only let the academia be the only voice that represents us, because it has been the case so far. So migrant communities, little by little, are achieving a bigger voice and more presence in museums, and that should be normalized. That's at least my idea. Since I'm here, I would also like to ask Hannah. Well, first of all, I wanted to thank all the speakers over the morning because you have offered a magnificent experience, just like the ones from yesterday. You have opened up our minds. You have given us new ideas about how to work and how to transition this path that we have already initiated. And just because of that, that we have initiated this path and being here, I think that's already good. So we should all congratulate ourselves on that. But Hannah, taking into account that we belong to an international non-profit organization that offers recommendations towards their members and the museum as a whole, that we could say it's the voice of museums on a global scale. We have such important things such as the definition of museum or the ontological code that already picked up on some aspects that are being dealt with nowadays about decolonization, although in the 86 and 2001 and 2004 that was not on the table, but that ethics was already picked up and it's going to be implemented today. It is being implemented in the new draft of the new deontological code. There's a working group that is working with strategies or recommendations that were included in the strategic plan for ICOM from 2022-2028. And I would like to get to know a little more so that you can talk a little bit deeper about the composition of this new working group, about the provenance, about the people that are working there, how you're working, what's your methodology, what are your goals. Can you tell us a little bit about the consultation that you're doing about future goals, the recommendations that you can make, and not from a paternalist point of view, let's say, but more in line with other recommendations and as help for other museums that possibly have not started this path, because we have different countries and different institutions that are working together but at different paces. So what are the future you can foresee? What are your goals for the future and how you're working? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Yeah, we started September last year practically. And by June next year, we have to deliver the first draft of our recommendations or our reports to the executive board. So we don't have much time. And this working, it used to be that people were asked to sit in a working group or a committee usually. But that ICOM is changing already. It's becoming more democratic. So now people could apply for this working group and other committees. And the interesting thing is that then we meet people in the working group who are young, who are new in ICOM, who are members just for 1 year, and others who have been there like, well, I think Catherine, like 35 years. So in that sense, there's a huge diversity already. And apart from that, I think the executive board, I think this working group had the most applications. So it was quite a job for the board to select. And in the end, we are, well, if I look at the members only, so we have a chair from the Netherlands and a chair from Nigeria. And then we have, so we have Camilla, who is Chile, from Chile. In Spain, we have Abir, who is Egyptian in Aberdeen. Catherine Cole, who is partly Canadian Indigenous. We have somebody from Pakistan, from India. Of course, I don't think of them all now, but it's a very mixed group. And our methodology, well, to be honest, I had no idea when I was going to start. When I applied too, and you could check member or chair, and I thought, well, I chaired another committee. I might do it again. Why not? It's nice. And so all of a sudden I was co-chair of this committee. And I think we did it in the organic way. That's actually what I like usually. we had to get to know each other. So the chairs started with meeting everybody individually online in the summer. And then from September, we had a meeting every month online. But I personally, and I think the others too, we felt the need of meeting each other or getting to know each other, eat together. I mean, that is where it starts, have meals together. And so my organization was very helpful, the Cultural Heritage Agency, in giving the funds to invite the group to the Netherlands. So we had a 2 days meeting over the weekend. And then on the Monday, we had this conference, which was also online, in which every member of the working group gave a presentation of their work at home, the practice, daily practice. And the ones who didn't give presentations were the moderators. So in that sense, we showed ourselves to the world in a way, and we got to meet each other. And over these 2 days, my main point was nobody leaves here before we have the map, the road, the steps towards our final report. Because what do we need for that? So that's what we did. We divided the tasks, and of course, there are some people who are more active than others. There's our member from Benin is French speaking, so for him it's a bit more difficult to follow it. But he's doing very well, and he's improving his English also, because English, we don't have translation, of course. So English is the language that we talk in, that we communicate in. And so that is the one road towards the report. And in the meantime, we assist other committees, like the Legal Affairs Committee, that wanted to make a checklist for restitution, to say it very bluntly. And the first thing our colleague from Barbados said, a checklist, it doesn't work in the Global South. That's a very Western, Northern concept. So we learn day by day. I learn every day, actually. We advised the Code of Ethics, this first draft, with lots of comments, actually. And so also in other CDOC, the Documentation Committee. So we are working together in other groups as well. We started with a survey in the international committees, the affiliated organizations, and the regional alliances. Actually, it was my idea to keep it to this relatively small group because it's a lot of work. But then, of course, there were complaints from the national committees. Why don't you send us the survey too? So we did a 2 steps process. And now the survey to the national committees has gone out too. And we organize online meetings, 2 for the international committees, 1 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon the next day, so that we can count with the time zones. So people who want to speak with us or want to ask things or want to advise us, they are welcome. And we will do the same for the national committees in November 23, 24, I think. Not sure, but you will keep an eye on that. And then, not many people attend. It was like 8 to 10 for each one. But that's okay. I mean, everybody who's there were some who only wanted to listen in without really contributing. So in that sense, we tried to understand as much as possible what are the committees doing. I mean, you have, and Portugal already 3 years ago, ICOM Portugal, a wonderful meetings on this topic of decolonization. So we want to know what's going on within ICOM. And in our report, I was very happy with one of the board members, Steph Scholt, who said, you have so little time, it can only be a preliminary report. And I agree with that. It will not be perfect. It will not be complete. And that's okay. We'll just go for, I mean, we are many people and we have many minds, so we will get many ideas. But it's not the end. It's just a start.
Hi, good afternoon. We have 3 questions from people following online questions. Following the session online, we have 3 questions. On the one hand, we have Alba. She wants to know about the access of original communities to the collections of museums, and she says that even though it's positive to promote accessibility, sometimes the communities are not even aware of the existence of collections. So she asks, how can we foster a better knowledge and access from the communities, for the communities from the museums, and whether the staff of the museums can have a more active approach by contacting the communities instead of having them to navigate through the online resources. Another question from Patricia was about the difficulties and the lessons that the different speakers have gone through in the process of opening up the museums to society in the matter of decolonization. She means the initiative of located museum, Museo Situado, from the Reina Sofia. But besides that, if besides Amanda, anyone else could answer with their experience. And the last question from Anna for all the speakers is whether the audience in museums is understanding this kind of decolonialist initiatives besides the intentions of the museum or ICOM, and whether we have any feedback from these initiatives. Thank you.
Regarding the accessibility of collections, yes, it's very hard for people who are not used to databases as they are made here. It's not easy to enter them and to search them. What we are doing in the Netherlands, we are building this data hub, and for that we invited people in a conference from the Caribbean, from Nigeria, from Benin, and a few other countries. And since then, they are the advisors in developing this database, in which, in the end, all the Dutch collections that come from a colonial context should be gathered together. So in that sense, they help us to tell what they need, and we build that into the system. Yeah, I'll keep it to this.
Understands overnight the decolonial debate because it's quite new. Specifically in the Thyssen Museum, there has been quite opposite reactions from the right-winged media and the opposition, because that means having less people than we expected. But even so, we have had 70,000 people to see the exhibition, approximately. And I think that the whole work that can be done so that society is more aware of the fact that this is not a matter that we should not be looking at, then well, I think from my point of view, maybe I'm too optimistic, but I think that just like in 2018 in Spain, we had the situation that the feminist agenda suddenly was out in the public and people were aware that it was just not a thing of just a few. I think this year, through all the initiatives that are being done, I think we're achieving the goal that people are aware that Spain is not Spain that was present during the Catholic king and queen times, you know. So it's a matter of taking measures to move forward and at the same time to educate people so that people can be more and more aware. I also wanted to say something that I think is important. I'm not quite big of a supporter that we can only take initiatives and specific actions in favor of feminism or decoloniality. People that are very specific. I would just say that there is a very interesting role that the ICOM has mentioned, and it is allies in museums. It's people that could be more sensitive to specific topics and that they can help. But I think this idea of an ally in the museum in order to to change and to make the museum move forward towards the acknowledgement of other voices and discourses, etc., and the presence of other collectives, I think that is very important. I think it is in feminism, not all men are sexists, and I think from the point of view of decoloniality is what Anibal was saying yesterday about demodernization. We can move towards demodernization in Europe and not only towards the decolonization. And I think that that's my opinion. Well, I would say that in specific terms that are initiatives that can be done if we think that not necessarily people have to come to the museum to understand what is happening in the museum. I wanted to give some examples that I know uh, at close distance, at least in the Reina Sofia. For example, it's the located visits, the visitas situadas, and it's visits from people from different communities, from the Bengal area, from Senegal, and they're starting from a situated or located mediation. It's a training that some members of these communities receive, and they give visits in their own language, Swalov or other languages that usually do not exist, not in audio guides, not in guided visits or anything, and they are mediated through paintings that can have a relevant significance towards that group. I think it is a very successful model, and I have had the chance to participate in some of those mediations in this training kind of process that is also accompanied by a training in rights, not only with the right of migrant communities, but also gender studies, where we talk about different debates. And the last project, which is very interesting, which is very recent, and it is a training course on art handling for people belonging to migrant communities. It is very interesting because it allows to have a certificate. They have a long term relationship with the museum. They receive training from the curator and everything for the registry of works, and it has been quite successful in this sense. And in the MOAC in Mexico, we had another project that was a collaboration with a low income neighborhood that is very close to Ciudad Universitaria, which was an independent cultural center that is very much rooted in the community. And we established a collaboration in which we went there and we decided collectively the kind of activities that were being done in the cultural center, but with resources from the museum. At the same time, they could also carry out activities in the museum. So, one of the components, and I agree in doing this critical education, is thinking that the current functions of the art museum or history museum or anthropology museum are very different to the traditional functions or that are, let's say, socially accepted of what a museum is. But it is the same thing with art. I mean, contemporary art, besides being very much linked to the market in some sense, it is very much accepted. It reaches validation prices and it is much more extended in social prices, and it's still questioned whether it is art or if it's not art. And in this sense, there's not a moment of simultaneity of an opinion where this will be completely accepted. It's not homogeneous. It's part of the rebuilding or rethinking of a cultural canon on culture and on museistic institutions. And I agree with Juan Angel that in no way we should only focus on one collective. There's a lot of things that museums have to do when it comes to experience of the museum. So how people visiting the museum live the museum, how we can be much more generous in our paths. There's also great development right now in ethnographic museums on museography, social museography. This idea of how to show a display of cultural objects that are still relevant for the original communities and how we can create collaborations. But also another very important aspect, and at least in the case of Mexico, there's an indigenous writer who is very important. Her name is Mije, and she's Naya Aguilar. And she talks about how the collections of the museums, at least in the case of Mexico, like codex and things like that. So, contemporary indigenous communities were rejected of their memories and their cultural objects that have a very different significance in this process of reparation or reconstruction, because it does not only mean giving objects back but also restoring the link and the memories with those histories. It's a reparation of a symbolic order that does not only have to do with giving the object back but also having the capability and the sensitivity of seeing how that tissue is built and that relation with that memory that would completely cut in this appropriation of cultural objects by institutions and modernity. I am going to talk specifically about the Portuguese example. We've done things with migrant communities, with Afro descendants, but as a whole, what I have seen is that these working processes have been very much focused, or they have had an answer from Afro descendants in Portugal from the second or third generation, but at least as a whole, most of them were done by with a master's degree or a PhD, so it would be some kind of elite. Same thing has happened with some Afro-descendant Brazilian people, because what ends up happening in Portugal is that when white Brazilian people, after a couple of generations, they feel like they're Portuguese, and the process has not reached who should have reached, which is the mostly working class immigrant communities. And we can understand that because they have hard jobs. In general, museums are expensive, and they don't have that much time to visit a museum. And it is a pity. And it is even more a pity because museums in Portugal, but more specifically in Lisbon, people working in the toilets, people working in security, they're African. And many of them, they're not even second generation. They just arrived from Africa and they're doing this job. They spend the whole day in the museum very often and they don't get asked about anything. And I think everyone has seen that, and I thought about the questions that I could ask. It could be something interesting to work with. And I think in the future, children are the ones who end up getting to the museum. It's children who are the sons and the daughters of those African, Brazilian, or Afro descendant communities. Or, for example, we've received a lot of people from Bangladesh, from Nepal to Portugal. And I think it's these children, the ones that have their possibilities because their parents are tired, they don't have time, and they don't have the money to go to a museum. And children, at least in Portugal, they can go in free. For free in Portugal, at least, because museums are free for children in Portugal, at least. And I wish they can get their degrees, they can get their education so that they can go into the museum, because the way to go in to enter a museum is to receive a bachelor's degree in art history or in curating or something like that. And I'm quite excited because, for example, in the museum that I worked at, people, the women working in the toilets, they're from Africa. The security people, they're from Africa, and they spend the whole day in the museum. So maybe we could have a dialogue with them and involve them. Por favor. One of the questions was whether the ICOMs work on decoloniality. I couldn't hear you properly. If you have had any relationship with the interest group that there has been in Latin America and the Caribbean that is working on education and decoloniality in museums. And I'm talking about this because very often I'm Irene and I work in the education area of the Museo del Prado. And I say education because it's a different debate whether this should be the name or not. But we get to content, and I think working from coloniality implicates a very clear methodology in which there are many trust spaces, and we have to work a lot of time in advance before we reach to get the contents in these exhibitions. So we need to work hand in hand with the emissaries from the beginning. So from 2021 we have the project. Sorry, I could not hear the name. But first of all, we have to get over the guilt that has come back very often. The ones that work there is white women. But from the beginning, we have worked with Julia Carrera, then with Daniela Martagon. It's people, it's women from migrant women communities. And it's a very good space. And the first exercise that we have tried to do is that the Museo del Prado has an infinite hallway. Since you go in, security, paintings, and contents, they're very potent, they're very strong, they're constant. So everything we do is from the area of education is to generate that space for silence so that new voices can go in. And then secondly, working from the uncertainty, which is completely contradictory with the scheme of museum that has a resultant kind of idea with regards to everything we know. That's why I'm insisting in that alliance between the people that are working in education that try to establish a horizontal view in the museum between the people that come and who do not come to the museum, and it's just trying to make the museum a more silent way to have new voices. That's just everything I wanted to say. Thank you. Let me respond very quickly. Well, Hannah said before, maybe she can talk a bit deeper about that. We have made a consultation, we have made contact with all international committees where we also have OTHECA. And I think it's a matter of, through OTHECA, getting in contact with a special interest group. It's a working group that they have on decolonization and education. I think that could be really interesting to find that relationship.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I got your question really precise. You were talking about the Caribbean. We have a member from Barbados. She's a curator. And she does projects with artists and with people. I'm not sure if they have an educational department. It's a very small museum. So I think this is all in one person practically. But in that sense, I think they do take the role of spreading the idea through working with artists, through co-curation. We see the same in Taiwan with our other colleague who works with indigenous groups in Taiwan. And so they organize there, especially around food and preparing methods, and that they communicate in the museum from an educational viewpoint also. It's not something that we have really taken into our working group as like you should also have an educational department, but it's always there practically.
I'll try to be brief. The truth is that with the passing of time, I have learned as a teacher, as a professor, and as a curator to avoid contradiction but more psychoanalysis. But there is a matter that has not appeared here in the debate, and I don't know if in the ICOM you think about it or not, or at least in the leading positions or high responsibility positions of different institutions as curators. It has to do with the relationship that we can find or how to articulate the discourse on decoloniality or decolonization that is promised by everyone with the problems that the associations of museums generate with private companies that at some point when they're doing an exhibition of the indigenous art in the Amazonian, for example, that is sponsored by a company that is just devastating the Amazon, for example. So, do you think about this problem from the ecom? Because I have suffered this in my own flesh to be invited to an encounter that is very famous for photography in the African continent. I paid my my flight was paid by a colonialist state, and my stay in in that continent was sponsored by a company that works in the exploitation of oil, for example, and many other things. So with the passing of time, with my age, I'm 47. I have learned to live with that contradiction without having to go to a psychologist. But I don't know if the ICOM is thinking about this kind of matters, or in museums, maybe the one in Tervuren, from the Thyssen, from the Reina Sofia. I don't know if you're thinking about this. Thank you.
Well, there's also a working group or a committee, Sustain, ICOM Sustain, which is about sustainability. So in any case, it will be covered there. We haven't taken it up as a special topic, but in our comments to the first draft now of the Code of Ethics, we did mention this. So maybe it should go more into the Code of Ethics than in just a working group report.
If I may add to that, I kind of imposed, because I really felt it was necessary, a code of ethics in the museum itself, because we have a very specific identity. And so the ICOM code of ethics, which exists, but which is now being looked at, was not sufficient for me. And at the same time, let me be honest, I have an enormous budget deficit. So for some things, I have to look to the private sector. But it's very clear that maybe those who very much want to sponsor my museum, I don't want to work with them. And it's also true, I've had, CEOs telling me, the captains, heads of private companies telling me, well, you're still too colonial. We don't want to be associated with you. So those who I would want to work with don't want to work with me. It's, I need a psychiatrist as well, probably.
I can add one more thing there. You have UNDRIP, the United Nations, on the rights of indigenous people. Declaration, it was a declaration, thank you. And that is very often combined with oil and indigenous land, or original land. So that there is already a declaration for that, and we refer to that all the time, actually.
I just wanted to say that, of course, everyone participating, at least from the art point of view, we live in a constant. People from the art world, we live in a constant contradiction, but there are limits. And there are companies that we could never think of working with, and there are limits. And it is not just like saying, okay, we need the money, let's work with whoever. I think there are limits, and I think that they are established by each institution in that sense, but that also has to do with something that, just like my colleagues were saying, with something that cultural current policies what they're doing is to reduce the budget for cultural and international context, such the critical situation that we're living with the idea that there are rich museums, let's say, in the US. It is so critical precisely because there's just a few public institutions in the US, and museums are subject to such a pressure from the sponsors that they are in the boards and they're making decisions, and museums have to accept exhibitions and donations of works of art because of the survival of institutions. So those contradictions are generated not only from the complex nature of art and environments in which we work, but also because of the funding models that we have and the cultural policies that are non existent or regressive that we live in nowadays. Not because in the public sphere everything is clear and everything is clean, because there are censorship situations in the public field as well. But the topic of the sustainability and the funding of institutions is a critical topic, not only for economic terms, but also in environmental terms, for human resources, for the salaries of the people working in the museums. It is a very complex situation. We need to learn how to navigate those contradictions, but of course, there are ethical limits that we should respect when it comes to the kind of funding that we accept. Thank you very much.